My brother tried to set my fiancé on fireon on our wedding day, and I still owe him one. My wedding day was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, it turned into a literal inferno. My brother setting the altar ablaze, tackling my fiancé into the flames, all while screaming he was trying to murder me. But that terrifying chaos was just the beginning of a truth so dark, it would shatter my entire world. What the hell happened next? 1 minute, I was walking down the aisle, feeling like a fairy tale bride. The next, my brother, Alex, was a blur of motion, sprinting past me, a red gas can in his hand. He doused the entire altar, those beautiful flower arrangements, everything in gasoline. The smell hit me first, sharp and acrid, then the whoosh as he lit it. Fire erupted, a monstrous orange tongue licking at the ceiling, and then Alex tackled my fiancé Mark right into the burning flowers. My veil caught fire, a searing heat against my neck, as guests stampeded towards the exit, their screams echoing through the church. Through the absolute pandemonium, I saw Alex pinning Mark down in the flames, punching him over and over, yelling something I couldn't hear above the sheer terror. Groomsmen finally dragged Alex off, his face a mask of primal fury. Mark was rolling on the ground, his hands and arms already covered in nasty second-degree burns. My mom was sobbing so hard, she actually threw up on her beautiful dress. My dad was just screaming at Alex, accusing him of destroying our family. 300 guests were calling 911, and Alex was still fighting the 4 men holding him. Blood streaming from his nose where the best man had clearly hit him. Even then, he was still screaming, his voice hoarse, insisting Mark was trying to kill me. Everyone rushed to comfort Mark, burned, bleeding, and crying. Elderly guests needed medical attention from the panic, and our sweet flower girl was just standing there, utterly traumatized. The priest prayed over the destroyed altar, and my bridesmaids sobbed, lamenting that Alex had ruined the most important day of my life. Finally, security arrived to arrest him. As the police cuffed him, Alex's voice, raw from smoke inhalation, cut through the noise with a chilling urgency. "Check the champagne," he yelled, struggling against the officers. The one he was about to give her for the toast. He's been poisoning her with mercury for months, and today's dose would have killed her before you even cut the cake. A suffocating silence descended. The only sound was the fire, still crackling through the smoldering ruins of our ceremony space. My entire world tilted on its axis. Alex, knowing he had seconds before they dragged him away, continued talking fast, desperate. Look at her hands shaking, her hair falling out in chunks. The confusion, she thinks, is just wedding stress. It's mercury poisoning. From the makeup he's been switching out since March, ever since they moved in together. My trembling hands flew to my scalp, my thinning hair, the clumps I'd been finding on my pillow every morning. Could it be true? Alex kept going, pulling out his phone. The cops hadn't confiscated it yet. "I have screenshots here," he gasped, of him asking his pharmacist friend about lethal doses, how to make it look like sudden illness. Plus receipts for mercury compounds he bought online using cryptocurrency, so it couldn't be traced. Mark started to stand, but the best man who moments ago was his protector held him back. I saw it, the grip had changed. It wasn't supportive anymore, it was restraining. Doubt crept across his face like a shadow. Alex wasn't finished. He took out a $3 million life insurance policy on her last month, without telling her. And their honeymoon suite, it already has a syringe of concentrated mercury hidden in his luggage. It would have caused complete organ failure within hours of injection. My aunt, a nurse, moved towards the champagne table. She dipped her finger into my glass, then immediately jerked back, a look of pure disgust on her face. "It smells wrong," she whispered, like metal and chemicals mixed with the champagne. More guests started frantically checking their phones, Googling mercury poisoning symptoms. Their eyes darted to me, then back to their screens as they recognized the signs I'd been showing for months. signs we'd all dismissed as wedding planning stress. Alex, still struggling, pulled up more evidence on his phone. Bank statements. Mark had been draining my savings account in small, insidious increments, amounts so tiny I hadn't noticed because I'd been too confused, too sick to check. He was setting himself up financially for after my death. But that's not even the worst part, Alex choked out, his voice breaking with raw desperation as two officers finally managed to hold his arms firmly. He already gave her a partial dose this morning. In her breakfast smoothie, he knew it would take effect during the reception to make my death look more natural. And the antidote window? It's closing fast. Mercury binds to your organs within hours. My brother explained how he'd broken into Mark's apartment last night. He'd found a journal hidden away. It documented every dose Mark had given me for 6 months, with chilling notes about my increasing symptoms and cold calculations for how much more I could take before dying. And worst of all, detailed plans for playing the grieving widower. Alex had gone to the police at 2 a.m., but Mark's uncle was the police chief. The chief had dismissed Alex, claiming there wasn't enough evidence for an arrest. Then he immediately called Mark to warn him that Alex was causing trouble. That's why Mark had moved up the timeline. That's when Alex realized the only way to save me was to stop the wedding. And setting the altar on fire? It was the only way to make sure the ceremony couldn't continue. Because Mark had manipulated me into thinking Alex was just jealous and unstable. The crowd turned, their gazes fixed on Mark. His face, which had been contorted in pain and victimhood, now shifted, transforming into something cold and calculating as he realized his entire monstrous plan was exposed to 300 witnesses. 2 groomsmen grabbed his arms, but he was moving faster than anyone expected from someone with burns, adrenaline overriding his pain. The cake table was right behind him. He grabbed the decorative knife we were supposed to use for cutting. He spun toward me before anyone could react, before anyone could stop him. His burned hand, disregarding the agony, locked around my neck. The blade pressed against my throat as he pulled me back against his chest, using me as a shield. The police officers who moments before were arresting Alex froze, their hands on their weapons. But Mark was using me as a perfect human shield. They couldn't get a clear shot. "Everyone stay exactly where you are," he said, his voice completely different now. Gone was the fake warmth I'd fallen in love with. It was cold, methodical, like he was reading from one of his pharmacy textbooks. Or I'll finish what I started right here, in front of everyone. The blade cut deeper as he dragged me backward, inch by agonizing inch, toward the kitchen doors. 300 people watched, frozen in shock. Alex fought against the 2 cops holding him, screaming at Mark to let me go. His face was twisted with pure desperation as he watched the man he'd tried to stop, now using me as a shield. The best man, who'd been holding Mark back, dropped his arms completely and stepped away, hands raised. He finally understood. He'd been protecting someone who'd been poisoning me for months. Even with the knife pressing into my skin, I forced myself to speak. My voice was a shaky whisper. "Mark," I rasped. "Everyone knows the truth now. Hurting me won't change anything." He pulled me tighter against his burned chest. "If I'm going down anyway," he snarled, "I might as well finish what I started. The mercury's already working through your system." The priest moved forward, both hands raised, like he was approaching a wild animal. He pleaded with Mark to think about his soul, what this would mean for eternity. Mark actually laughed at that, a bitter sound, unlike anything I'd ever heard from him. "God stopped listening to me years ago," he sneered, "when the debt started piling up. You became my only way out." Right then, a huge crack split the air as part of the burning altar collapsed, sending sparks shooting across the church floor. Everyone flinched, even Mark. It was my chance. I drove my elbow back into his burned ribs as hard as I could. I felt his grip loosen, just enough for me to drop my full weight down, twisting away from the blade. The knife caught my shoulder as I fell, slicing through my dress and into my skin. I kept moving, hitting the marble floor hard, while Mark lunged after me. 3 officers tackled him before he could reach me. The knife went flying across the floor as they pinned him down, his burned hands leaving bloody prints on the white marble as he fought them. EMTs rushed over to me, while the cops cuffed Mark, who was still screaming that I deserved this for being too stupid to notice what he'd been doing for 6 whole months. Alex broke free from the officers holding him and dropped to his knees beside me, apologizing over and over for not finding another way to save me. Tears mixed with the blood still running from his nose. The EMTs pressed gauze against my shoulder wound, explaining they needed to get me to the hospital right away for something called chelation therapy to counteract the mercury poisoning. My mother collapsed into my father's arms, sobbing, and I heard my father tell Alex he'd saved my life, his voice breaking on the words. The EMTs lifted me onto a stretcher and rushed me out, past all the wedding guests still standing there in shock, past the burning altar, now mostly smoking ruins, past the champagne table with my poison glass still sitting there. In the ambulance, an EMT with a name tag reading Johann started in 4 in my arm, explaining that mercury poisoning needed immediate treatment to prevent permanent organ damage. My whole body was shaking now, but not from fear. It was the poison affecting my nervous system, making my muscles twitch and jerk without my control. Johann kept talking in this calm voice about how the treatment would help, but I could barely focus. My vision kept blurring, and my head felt like it was full of cotton. The ambulance pulled up to the emergency room, and they wheeled me straight in. A doctor, who turned out to be the same Johann from the ambulance, took over my case. He ordered blood tests right away to confirm the mercury levels while nurses hooked me up to monitors that started beeping with my vital signs. Johann explained that the chelation drugs would bind to the mercury so my body could get rid of it, but we'd caught it just in time, thanks to Alex's intervention. The blood draw made me dizzy, and I could see my hands shaking worse now. Little tremors I couldn't control, no matter how hard I tried to hold them still. Johann said that was normal for mercury poisoning, and that the shaking would get better once the treatment started working, but might take weeks or even months to fully recover. It seemed awfully convenient how Mark's uncle just happened to be the police chief who dismissed all the evidence at 2 a.m. That timing felt too perfect for someone planning a murder during a wedding ceremony full of witnesses. Nurses kept coming in and out, checking my vitals and adjusting the 4 while Johann reviewed test results on his tablet with this worried look that made my stomach drop. He finally told me my mercury levels were dangerously high, way above what they'd normally see even in industrial accidents. It proved Mark had been giving me massive doses. The chelation medicine burned going into my veins and made me feel sick, but Johann said that meant it was working, pulling the mercury out of my organs where it had been building up for months. My parents arrived then with my aunt, who immediately started asking Johann about treatment protocols and recovery times using all these medical terms I didn't understand. Then a woman in a dark suit walked in, carrying a badge that said State Police. She introduced herself as Detective Nissa Lawson, saying she was taking over the case because the local police chief had a conflict of interest. She pulled out a notebook and started writing down everything Johann was telling her about my mercury levels, while my mother kept touching my arm, like she needed to make sure I was still there. Detective Lawson said, with 300 wedding guests as witnesses and all the physical evidence Alex found, Mark wouldn't get away with what he'd done to me. She left to collect evidence, but came back 20 minutes later, carrying plastic bags with a champagne glass from the wedding and a sample from the smoothie Mark made me that morning. The field tests showed crazy high levels of mercury in both, enough to kill me if I'd consumed all of it. She sealed everything up for the crime lab. Alex showed up then, with 2 officers holding his arms. Burns were visible on his skin from the altar fire, and his eyes were swollen shut where the best man had hit him. Detective Lawson told the officers to take the cuffs off because Alex's actions were clearly defensive and he'd saved my life. They were releasing him on his own recognizance. He just stood there, staring at me with this look of profound relief on his face, while the nurses drew more blood from my arm for additional tests. The results came back showing my mercury levels were even higher than they'd first thought, almost at the lethal point. But Johann said the interrupted dosing meant my organs hadn't completely failed yet. He started me on something called aggressive chelation therapy, explaining I'd need multiple rounds over the next few months with careful monitoring to make sure the mercury was clearing from my system. The police chief suddenly burst through the door, demanding to see his nephew. But Detective Lawson stepped right in front of him and told him he was suspended pending investigation for obstruction of justice. He started yelling about lawsuits and how she had no authority. But she held up paperwork showing state police had taken over jurisdiction because of his involvement in covering up attempted murder. He stormed out, slamming doors, while Detective Lawson made a call to have someone follow him to make sure he didn't try to interfere with the investigation. A woman named Francine Price from the district attorney's office arrived next. She pulled up a chair beside my bed to take my statement about everything that had happened over the past 6 months. She was writing fast while I talked about the symptoms I'd been having, the confusion and shaking I thought was just wedding stress, and how Mark had been so caring when I felt sick. Francine said she was fast-tracking charges for attempted murder in the first degree, plus poisoning and fraud. With all the evidence and witnesses, she felt confident about getting a conviction. The wedding photographer knocked on the door then, holding a bag full of memory cards, explaining he'd captured everything on camera, from Alex's attack to Mark holding the knife to my throat. Detective Lawson took the memory cards as evidence, saying the footage would be crucial for showing the jury exactly what happened and proving Alex was trying to save me, not hurt anyone. A man in a suit showed up, introducing himself as Adam Bailey, saying he was representing Alex and needed to discuss defense strategy for the arson and assault charges. Alex told him he didn't want any defense that claimed he was crazy or didn't know what he was doing, because he knew exactly what he was doing and would do it again to save me. Adam kept pushing about a temporary insanity or necessity defense, given the imminent threat to my life. But Alex just shook his head and said he'd rather go to jail than pretend he was sorry for stopping a murder. Johann came back with more test results, this time from hair samples they'd taken, and his face was grim as he showed us the charts. The mercury levels in my hair went back 6 months, starting small and getting bigger over time, proving Mark had been systematically poisoning me, just like Alex said. The timeline matched perfectly with the journal Alex found, showing how Mark carefully increased the doses to avoid sudden death that would look suspicious. Each sample showed higher concentrations, with notes about which sections of hair corresponded to which months, creating a perfect record of attempted murder. Johann said this kind of evidence was rare because most poisoning victims don't survive long enough for testing. But Alex's intervention had saved not just my life, but also preserved the proof. My hands were shaking worse, now, as the reality hit me. The man I was going to marry had been killing me slowly for half a year, calculating doses and watching me get sicker while pretending to care. Detective Lawson took photos of all the test results and said this evidence, combined with the journal, would make it impossible for Mark to claim innocence or accident. She was building a case that would put him away for decades, maybe life, and she promised me he'd never be able to hurt me or anyone else again. The next morning, Detective Lawson called to say they'd arrested the pharmacist friend at his job, dragging him out in handcuffs while his coworkers watched in shock. She told me he tried to run when he saw the cops coming, but they caught him in the parking lot, and now he was sitting in jail with a lawyer telling him not to say anything. The cops had traced all those cryptocurrency transactions Alex found, plus hundreds of text messages between him and Mark discussing exact doses and how to make it look natural. Mark got formally charged with attempted murder in the first degree 2 days later, along with poisoning, fraud, and assault with a deadly weapon for holding that knife to my throat. His lawyer tried to get bail, but the judge took one look at the evidence and said no way, not with him being a flight risk and the danger he posed to me. The courtroom was packed with reporters and wedding guests who'd come to watch, and Mark just sat there in his orange jumpsuit, his burned hand still bandaged. Staring at me like this was somehow my fault. After 5 days in the hospital, they finally let me go home, though I had to come back every single day for more chelation treatments that made me feel sick and weak. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I kept finding clumps of hair in the shower drain. But the doctor said these symptoms would get better with time and treatment. The insurance company called while I was packing up my hospital room, saying the $3 million policy was void because of the fraud and attempted murder, and they were adding insurance fraud to the list of charges against Mark. Alex got charged with arson and assault, but Francine from the district attorney's office recommended minimal charges, since he'd saved my life. The judge agreed to probation and community service instead of jail time, saying Alex's actions were justified given the circumstances and the immediate threat to my life. That's when the media found out about everything, and suddenly our wedding disaster was all over the news, with reporters camping outside my parents' house and calling everyone we knew for comments. We had to hire a publicist just to handle all the media requests and keep them from following me to my medical appointments. The church sent us a bill for $30,000 in damages from the fire, but they withdrew it immediately when our publicist explained the full story to them. The priest actually called to apologize for not seeing the signs of abuse earlier and offered free counseling services if I needed them. 3 different wedding guests contacted Detective Lawson, saying they'd seen Mark acting weird with my drinks at parties and dinners over the past year. One bridesmaid broke down crying when she admitted she'd noticed my symptoms months ago but thought it was just wedding stress. And now she felt terrible for not saying something sooner. Detective Lawson found Mark's laptop and discovered he'd searched mercury poisoning symptoms and how long before mercury kills hundreds of times over the past 6 months. He'd also been researching countries that don't extradite to the United States, bookmarking articles about fleeing the country and living under fake identities after committing crimes. The bank investigation turned up even worse stuff, showing he'd stolen over $40,000 from my accounts in tiny amounts I never noticed because I was too confused from the poisoning to check my statements. He'd also applied for 5 credit cards in my name without telling me, racking up $20,000 in debt, buying expensive stuff he could sell later for cash. Detective Lawson said each new piece of evidence made the case stronger, and with everything they had now, he was looking at 25 years minimum if convicted. The pharmacist friend's lawyer reached out about a deal, saying his client would testify against Mark in exchange for a lighter sentence since he was just an accomplice. Just an accomplice? The way he tried to run when police showed up tells me he knew exactly how wrong this was all along. Francine said they'd probably take the deal because his testimony would seal the case, even though she wanted both of them to rot in prison for what they'd done to me. My parents had to change their phone number because reporters wouldn't stop calling, and my dad installed security cameras after someone tried to climb over the fence to get pictures. The story went viral online, with people arguing about whether Alex was a hero or a criminal, though most agreed he'd done the right thing, even if his methods were extreme. Mark's family tried to visit him in jail, but he refused to see them, probably because he knew they'd figure out he was guilty once they heard all the evidence. His mother sent me a letter through her lawyer, screaming that I'd ruined her son's life and destroyed their family, but I threw it away without reading past the first line. The fire marshal finished his investigation and officially ruled the altar fire as a justified emergency action to prevent a murder in progress. This helped Alex's case a lot since it showed his actions were necessary and proportional to the threat, not just random violence or revenge. More evidence kept coming in as Detective Lawson dug deeper, including receipts for the mercury compounds hidden in Mark's storage unit, along with syringes and medical equipment. She also found a draft email he never sent, outlining his plan to make my death look like sudden organ failure from an undiagnosed condition, complete with fake symptoms he claimed I'd been having. The hospital set me up with Alger Scott 2 weeks later, a counselor who worked with people who'd survived murder attempts. She had this small office with plants everywhere and a box of tissues on every surface, which made sense once we started talking. Algra asked me to walk through the whole relationship from the beginning, and I started seeing all these red flags I'd missed. Mark had pushed me to move in together really fast, isolated me from friends who didn't like him, and always made me feel crazy when I questioned anything. She explained how abusers work, how they test boundaries slowly, making you doubt yourself until you can't trust your own thoughts anymore. The poisoning was just the final step in months of breaking me down mentally first. While I was dealing with therapy, Mark's family sent a letter through their lawyer that made me shake with anger. They weren't sorry about what their son did. They were mad at me for ruining his life by not helping with his gambling debts. His mother wrote that if I'd been a better partner and supported him financially, none of this would have happened. They actually blamed me for driving him to try to kill me, like I'd forced him to buy mercury and plan my murder for months. The lawyer wanted to set up a meeting to discuss how I could help their family recover from the damage I'd caused them. I threw the letter in the trash and told my lawyer to send them a cease and desist order. Ross Cartwright from the fire marshal's office came to my parents' house with his final report 3 weeks after the wedding. He'd spent hours interviewing witnesses, reviewing the evidence Alex had, and reconstructing exactly what happened that day. His official ruling said Alex's actions were a justified emergency response to prevent an imminent murder. The report specifically noted that with the police chief refusing to act and the final dose about to be administered, setting the fire was the only way to stop the ceremony. This was huge for Alex's defense, since it showed he wasn't just some crazy person attacking randomly. Adam Bailey, Alex's lawyer, said this report would probably get most of the charges dropped or reduced to almost nothing. During my next treatment session, Dr. Kramer sat down with my latest test results, and his face was serious. The good news was the mercury levels were dropping, and most of it would clear my system eventually, but he explained that mercury causes permanent damage to nerve cells that can't always be fixed. My hands would probably always have a slight tremor, especially when I was tired or stressed. Some of the cognitive effects might linger, too, like trouble concentrating or remembering things sometimes. He said, I was lucky Alex stopped it when he did, because another few doses would have caused brain damage that couldn't be reversed. The tremor in my hands got worse as he talked, and I realized I'd be carrying proof of what Mark did to me for the rest of my life. The grand jury met a month after the wedding, and Francine Price presented everything they'd found. Beyond the attempted murder and poisoning charges, investigators had discovered Mark had stolen my identity to open credit cards and take out loans. He'd forged my signature on documents and created fake email accounts in my name to approve transactions. The grand jury indicted him on 15 different charges, including attempted murder in the first degree, aggravated assault, identity theft, and fraud. His lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal for 15 years, but Francine refused anything less than 25. She told me she wanted him locked up until he was too old to hurt anyone else. Alex came over one evening when my parents were out, and we sat on the back porch where we used to play as kids. He finally told me everything about that night, how he'd broken into the apartment and found the journal hidden behind other books, reading Mark's notes about my symptoms getting worse, calculating how much more mercury I could take, planning exactly how to act after I died. He tried calling me, but Mark had blocked his number on my phone without me knowing. Going to the police chief at 2 a.m. was his last hope for legal help. When the chief called Mark instead of arresting him, Alex knew he had hours at most before I'd be dead. He bought the gas can at an all-night station and spent the drive to the church trying to think of any other way. Setting the altar on fire was the only thing he could think of that would stop everything completely. We both started crying, and I told him I'd never be able to thank him enough for saving my life. The state police arrested the chief 2 months after the wedding on charges of obstruction of justice and abuse of power. They'd found phone records showing he called Mark right after Alex came to him with evidence. He'd also destroyed the initial report Alex tried to file and told other officers to ignore any calls about the situation. His 30-year career was over, and he was looking at up to 5 years in prison, though everyone knew he'd probably get less. Watching him in handcuffs on the news felt like a small bit of justice. I went back to work part-time after 3 months, but it was harder than I expected. The mercury had messed with my ability to focus, and I'd lose track of what I was doing halfway through tasks. My hands shook when I tried to type, and I had to take breaks every hour because I got so tired. My boss was really understanding and let me work from home most days with flexible hours. But sitting at my desk trying to concentrate on spreadsheets while my hands trembled made me wonder if I'd ever feel like myself again. The pharmacist friend who'd helped plan everything finally flipped when faced with doing real prison time. His lawyer contacted Francine, saying he'd testify against Mark in exchange for a lighter sentence. He had detailed records of every conversation they'd had about dosing, timing, and how to make it look natural. Text messages showed Mark asking about drug interactions and whether mercury would show up in a standard autopsy. The pharmacist had even kept notes about Mark's plan to inject me with a final concentrated dose on our honeymoon. With his testimony, the case against Mark was basically guaranteed to end in conviction. My parents announced they were separating the week before the trial was supposed to start. The stress of everything had made problems that were already there impossible to ignore anymore. My mom blamed my dad for pushing me to get married, saying he'd ignored her concerns about Mark because he wanted me settled down. My dad blamed her for not seeing the signs of abuse, saying a mother should have noticed her daughter was poisoned. They'd been fighting constantly since the wedding and finally decided they needed space. Watching my family fall apart because of what Mark did to us made me hate him even more than the poisoning itself. Detective Lawson called me the next morning while I was at another treatment session. Her voice tight with something she'd just discovered. She'd gotten a warrant for Mark's credit card records and found monthly payments to a storage facility across town that he'd rented 3 months before we got engaged. The hazmat team found 12 vials of mercury compounds in there, plus syringes already loaded with different doses, and a notebook where he'd written out backup plans if the wedding poisoning didn't work. He'd planned to keep dosing me after we were married, making it look like a chronic illness that would slowly kill me over years while he played the devoted husband caring for his sick wife. The storage unit also had fake medical records he'd created, showing I had a family history of neurological problems, setting up a story for after my death. I threw up when she told me about the children's medicine bottles he'd filled with mercury, planning to leave them around our future house, so it would look like an accidental poisoning if anyone got suspicious. My treatments continued for 6 more months, with me going to the hospital 3 times a week at first, then twice, then finally just once for monitoring. Dr. Kramer ran blood tests every visit, watching my mercury levels slowly drop from the dangerous red zone into yellow, then finally into the safe range. Finding 12 vials of mercury in that storage unit makes me wonder exactly how long Mark had been planning this whole thing. Was it really just for our marriage, or had he done this before? My hair started growing back in patches at first, then more evenly, though it came in thinner and a different texture than before. The tremors in my hands got better, but never completely went away, especially when I was tired or stressed. Some days were worse than others, with headaches that made me want to stay in bed and confusion that made me forget simple things like where I'd put my keys. Dr. Kramer said I was lucky to have survived it all, that most people with my levels of exposure would have permanent kidney damage or worse. The trial date got set for 8 months after the wedding, giving both sides time to prepare and letting me recover enough to testify. Jury selection alone took 2 weeks because of all the media coverage, with potential jurors admitting they'd already formed opinions after seeing the wedding video that someone had leaked online. The judge had to bring in people from neighboring counties to find anyone who hadn't heard about the burning altar and the hostage situation. Seeing Mark in court for the first time since that day made my whole body shake, and I had to run to the bathroom to throw up before we even started. He'd lost weight in jail, and his burns had healed into shiny pink scars on his hands and arms. But his eyes were the same cold calculation I'd seen when he held the knife to my throat. I testified for 3 straight days, going through every symptom I'd ignored, every lie I'd believed, every time I'd trusted him with my life without knowing he was slowly taking it. His lawyer tried to make me look crazy, asking if I'd imagined symptoms or exaggerated them for attention. But the medical records spoke for themselves. She asked why I hadn't noticed my money disappearing or my health declining, trying to make me look stupid or careless. I explained how the mercury made me confused, how he'd convinced me the symptoms were from wedding stress, how he'd isolated me from friends who might have noticed something was wrong. When I described the moment, he grabbed the knife and pressed it to my throat. Several jurors were visibly upset, and one woman had tears running down her face. Alex took the stand next, still looking guilty about the fire, even though everyone knew he'd saved my life. He broke down completely when the prosecutor showed the journal entries, where Mark had calculated exactly how much mercury would kill me, with notes like, "She's weaker than expected," and "increase morning dose." The courtroom was dead silent, except for Alex sobbing as he read out loud the entry from the night before the wedding that said, "Tomorrow she dies." He testified about finding the evidence, trying to get help from the police, and making the desperate decision to burn the altar when he realized no one would stop the wedding. Even the judge looked affected when Alex described watching me deteriorate for months, seeing the signs but not understanding what they meant until almost too late. The pharmacist testified next as part of his plea deal, looking at the floor the whole time as he admitted to helping plan my murder. He confirmed every detail, showing text messages where Mark asked about drug interactions and how to make mercury poisoning look like natural illness. Mark stared at him with pure hatred the entire testimony, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles went white. The pharmacist admitted he'd known it was wrong, but needed the money Mark promised him, and that he'd provided the specific compounds and dosing schedules. The defense tried to argue temporary insanity, bringing in an expert who talked about financial pressure and mental breaks. But their own witness had to admit that the months of planning, the detailed journal, and the backup plans showed clear premeditation and understanding of right and wrong. The journal entries were especially damaging, showing how he'd tracked my symptoms with scientific precision and adjusted doses based on my reactions. After 5 days of waiting while the jury deliberated, they finally came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. Mark didn't react at all, just stared straight ahead like he'd expected it. But his mother started screaming from the gallery that I destroyed their family and ruined her son's life. At sentencing 3 weeks later, I gave my victim impact statement, my voice shaking as I described how he'd stolen my ability to trust anyone, my health, and my sense of safety in my own home. I told the court about the nightmares, the therapy sessions, the days when I couldn't leave my apartment because I was afraid of everyone. The judge listened to everything, then sentenced Mark to 35 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, saying it was one of the most calculated and cruel attempted murders he'd seen in 30 years on the bench. 3 weeks after that, the police chief's trial started, and I had to watch him sit there in his dress uniform, trying to look dignified, while the prosecutor laid out how he protected his nephew, even after seeing evidence of attempted murder. The chief kept adjusting his tie and staring at the wall behind the judge, like he couldn't believe this was happening to him after 30 years in law enforcement. His lawyer tried arguing that he'd just been protecting family and hadn't known the full extent of the plot. But the phone records showed he'd called Mark within minutes of Alex coming to him with a journal. The prosecutor showed text messages where the chief told his nephew to handle the situation and warned him that Alex was making waves, which directly led to Mark accelerating his timeline to kill me that day. When the verdict came back guilty on obstruction of justice and abuse of power, the chief's wife started crying in the gallery while he just sat there with his jaw clenched. The judge gave him 2 years in state prison, plus permanent loss of his pension and law enforcement certification, saying he betrayed the public trust in the worst possible way. The pharmacist's sentencing happened a month later, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years since his arrest, his hand shaking as he stood before the judge. He'd cooperated fully with prosecutors, and his testimony had been crucial in convicting Mark, which his lawyer kept emphasizing while asking for leniency. The judge acknowledged his cooperation, but said providing poison to kill someone was still attempted murder, regardless of who actually administered it. He got 5 years with possibility of parole in 2, plus permanent loss of his pharmacy license, and in order to pay restitution for all my medical bills, which would probably bankrupt him. Alex's community service started that spring, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone that he had to teach fire safety courses at the same community center where we'd taken swimming lessons as kids. He showed up every Saturday morning for 6 months straight, teaching people about controlled burns and emergency responses while making dark jokes about becoming an expert through personal experience. The kids in his classes loved him because he'd act out the demonstrations and make it fun instead of boring, though their parents would whisper about him being that guy who set the church on fire. By summer, I'd started going to a support group for crime victims that met every Tuesday in the basement of the library, sitting in a circle of metal chairs, drinking bad coffee. That's where I met Adam, who was there because his ex-girlfriend had tried to run him over with her car after he'd broken up with her for stealing from his business. He understood why I flinched when people moved too fast, or why I still checked my food for weird smells, and he never pushed me to talk about things I wasn't ready to share. We started getting coffee after meetings, then dinner once a week, taking things so slow that it was 3 months before he even held my hand. My parents' divorce papers were filed that fall, and they sat me down together to explain that the trauma had just exposed problems that were already there, not caused new ones. Mom had apparently been unhappy for years, and Dad had been ignoring it, and watching their daughter almost die made them realize they were wasting their lives pretending. They were weirdly better as friends than they'd been as spouses, showing up separately to my therapy appointments, but texting each other updates about how I was doing. The 1-year anniversary of the wedding came faster than expected, and I spent that day with Alex at his apartment, both of us avoiding talking about it while watching movies and eating takeout. I showed him the latest test results from Dr. Kramer, proving my mercury levels were finally normal, and my liver function had recovered almost completely. He kept the paper on his fridge with a magnet right next to his fire safety instructor certification that he'd earned after completing all his community service hours. We'd grown closer through this nightmare than we'd ever been as kids, texting every day and having dinner together twice a week. The church called me that winter to say they'd finished rebuilding, and the priest wanted to invite me to a blessing ceremony for the new altar. I thanked them but declined, knowing I'd never be able to walk into that building without smelling gasoline and smoke or seeing Alex tackle Mark into the flames. The priest understood and said he'd pray for my continued healing, which was nice, even though I hadn't been religious since that day. Mark's mother sent a letter through her lawyer saying her son wanted to apologize and explain his actions, hoping for forgiveness before his first parole hearing in 25 years. Adam was at my apartment when it arrived, and he took it from my hands before I could even finish reading the return address, walking straight to the kitchen and dropping it in the trash, unopened. I didn't need to hear anything Mark had to say, and wouldn't give him the satisfaction of thinking I cared about his apologies or explanations. His mother actually sent a letter asking me to forgive him before his parole hearing? That's rich, considering she screamed that I ruined her son's life when he got convicted for trying to murder me with mercury poisoning. 2 years after the wedding, Adam and I were cooking dinner at my apartment when he turned off the stove and got down on one knee right there in my tiny kitchen. He didn't have a ring or a speech prepared, just said he loved me and wanted to spend his life with me if I'd have him. No pressure and no rush. I said yes because I'd learned to trust again through therapy and time, though we both agreed immediately that we'd get married at the courthouse with just immediate family present. My health had mostly recovered by then, though I still got tremors in my hands when I was stressed, and my hair never grew back as thick as it used to. These reminders of what happened didn't define me, but they were part of my story now. Battle scars from surviving someone who'd claimed to love me while slowly poisoning me to death. Alex started teaching those fire safety classes every Tuesday night at the community center, demonstrating proper extinguisher use and evacuation procedures to groups of 20 or 30 people who probably wondered why the instructor's hand shook when he lit the demonstration fires. The third week, a woman stayed after class to ask him about the scar on his forearm from where burning debris had caught him that night, and he told her the whole story while they stacked chairs and swept the floor. She came back the next week with homemade cookies for the class and stayed after again to help clean up, this time asking about his work as a carpenter and whether he'd always been protective of his family. They went for coffee after the 5th class, and within 2 months they were dating, holding hands at family dinners where she'd squeeze his fingers whenever someone mentioned the wedding. I watched them together at Thanksgiving, how she calmed his nervous energy and made him laugh with stories about her kindergarten students, and felt genuine happiness seeing him build something good from the worst night of our lives. 3 years after the wedding, I stood in the state capitol building with a thick folder of evidence, medical records, and testimony from dozens of victims who'd contacted me after our story made national news. The representative from our district introduced the Protective Partners Act, requiring banks to flag suspicious account activity in joint accounts, insurance companies to notify both parties of new policies, over $50,000, and mandatory reporting for medical professionals who suspect poisoning in domestic situations. The committee asked me questions for 2 hours about detection methods, warning signs, and how my case could have been prevented with proper safeguards in place. Adam sat in the gallery taking notes, while Alex watched from the back row, both of them there for every hearing and revision until the legislation passed with only 3 dissenting votes. The signing ceremony happened on a Tuesday afternoon with the governor, using 5 different pens to sign his name, giving me the first one in a small wooden box that now sits on our mantel next to our wedding photo from the courthouse. Adam and I had our daughter 14 months later, naming her after my aunt who'd first confirmed the poison that day, though we just call her Annie for short. She came out screaming with thick dark hair and her father's nose, gripping my finger so tight the nurse joked she'd inherited her uncle's protective instincts. Alex cried when he held her for the first time, whispering promises about keeping her safe that I knew he'd keep because he'd already proven what he'd do for family. We told her age-appropriate versions of the story as she grew, how Uncle saved Mommy from a bad man, though we saved the full details for when she'd be old enough to understand without being scared. Alex took the fire investigator exam 4 years after the wedding, scoring in the top 5% and getting hired by the county immediately. He worked 60-hour weeks studying burn patterns, accelerant traces, and witness statements, becoming the guy other departments called for complicated cases. His reports were so thorough that prosecutors loved getting his cases because convictions were almost guaranteed, and he testified with the same intensity he'd shown that day at the altar. He found his calling in protecting others the way he'd protected me, turning his trauma into purpose that saved other families from losing everything to arson. 5 years after the wedding, I was buying coffee downtown when someone called my name, and I turned to find the best man standing there with his own drink and an expression like he'd seen a ghost. He asked if we could sit for a minute and spent 10 minutes apologizing for hitting Alex, for not seeing the truth sooner, for being part of the group that almost let me die. I told him it wasn't his fault because Mark had fooled everyone, but he shook his head and said he should have noticed the symptoms, should have questioned the life insurance, should have done something. We didn't exchange numbers or promise to stay in touch, but the conversation gave us both closure we hadn't known we needed. My mother met her second husband at grief counseling, a widower whose wife had died of actual cancer, not attempted murder disguised as illness. He was patient with her guilt about not protecting me, gentle when she woke up crying from nightmares about that burning altar, and never minded when family dinners included long discussions about the trial or my ongoing health monitoring. Their wedding was tiny just immediate family in his backyard with a justice of the peace and grocery store cake. But watching her smile again without that haunted look behind her eyes helped heal something in me, too. Annie's 5th birthday party was at the park near our house. 30 kids from her preschool running around while parents chatted over juice boxes and pizza. Alex pushed her on the swing while she shrieked with joy. Adam manned the grill, flipping burgers for the adults. And both my parents sat at a picnic table, peacefully discussing vacation plans with my mother's new husband. This normal moment, with chocolate cake and party games and kids arguing over toys, felt like the greatest victory after everything we'd survived. 10 years have passed since that burning altar and the knife at my throat. And days go by now where I don't think about it at all. Too busy with Annie's school projects and Adam's promotion and Alex's engagement party and my mother's garden club fundraiser. My tremor only shows up during extreme stress. My hair grew back thicker than before, thanks to some expensive treatments, and the scar on my throat faded to a thin white line that most people don't even notice. My life is full of people who actually want me alive and happy, which turns out is everything I ever really needed. It's been a wild ride and I'm still here. Have you ever faced a moment where everything you believed was shattered in an instant? Or had someone fight for you when no one else would? Tell me what you think in the comments. I really want to know.